Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Family Couch. I am so excited to have with us on today as our guest, John Sovec, and we're going to be talking about how to support your child who is LGBT or identifies in the LGBT community. So, John, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this. It's a passion of mine, helping parents, helping teens, helping therapists learn about this really unique population and how to help them in the coming out process.
I agree. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, because John and I, we just kind of mentioned that we've been pretty much friends online for about 5 years now. So I know his expertise and I know his heart and his passion. So I really wanted him to be on to speak about this topic and this population.
Yeah, it's just really important to me.
Yes. So before we jump into all of the questions, can you give our audience a bit about who you are and what you do?
So actually, I have an office in Pasadena, California. I am a psychotherapist, and I specialize in working with LGBTQ adolescents and their families during the coming out process.
Yes.
And I think it's important that it's not just the teen I help, but it's also the families as well. Really important component of the process. I also do a lot of education out there. I am an adjunct professor at Phillips Graduate University, and I travel the country speaking at conferences, working with treatment centers, schools, all kinds of different ways to help kids learn, and clinicians learn, and parents learn, just getting out there.
I love that. And I love that you have that breadth of knowledge and that breadth of kind of expertise where it's like you don't just work with the family, but you go out and you speak and you teach others how to be supportive too, because you're only one person, right? There's not more of you that we can replicate.
The reason that came up for me was actually when I was in school, I noticed that although we had like a snippet, maybe 3 hours in my entire time being there of learning about the LGBTQ population as a whole, there was absolutely no conversation about supporting LGBTQ teens. And nobody was talking about or educating on this process of what they go through. And, you know, it's an important thing to understand as a clinician, because these kids are going through a lot, especially when they're in school, going through a very heteronormative experience.
Yes. Yes. And that's something that I think is really important. So when you say the word heteronormative, what does that mean? Like, what is that actual topic or that term?
Well, let me ask you this. And I'm just going to put this out there and ask all of our viewers to think about this too. When did you have to come out as straight? And I like to ask that question when I do speaking engagements, because what it brings up is that idea that as an LGBTQ person, I have gone through a process that a straight person, even a gay-friendly therapist, may not have gone through. And to understand that in a school system, it's been designed in a way that it takes into account most heterosexual stories, but it doesn't open up room for the homosexual story or anywhere on the gender or sexual orientation spectrum.
That's a really interesting point of view. And it's something that when I was learning how to be more of an ally and more of an understanding kind of clinician for this population, I realized that there are even terminologies that we use. So when someone says, oh, I met someone, we go based on whoever their opposite gender is. So if I say, oh, I met someone, they go, who is he? You know, if you say, I met someone, they go, oh, who is she? Right? That we just kind of assume that you are going to be dealing with heterosexual kind of relationships and identities. Is that correct? Is that something that you notice as well?
Yeah, and it's all over the place. It's not even subtle. It's a very dominant story. And when you're an LGBTQ adolescent, you may not have the tools to be able to speak out or, you know, have strength against that dominant story. And that can cause a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. You know, there are a lot of studies that are put out there. One of the greatest ones is by Gleason. That's the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And every 2 years, they do this online study. I think the last one, 2015, they had over 12,000 respondents. And the thing that they're finding is that even as we're starting to modernize and open up these conversations, that close to 70% of kids who identify as LGBTQ still feel that they're unsafe at school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, more than half of them have been bullied in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Often verbally, over 30% have been physically assaulted. And these are things that these kids should not have to be going through.
Agreed.
And I think we as therapists get to work with this, but also school systems get to use to work with it. Parents get to understand how important it is to speak up at their schools to create support. And, you know, there's a lot going on with these kids that we still need to create systems of support for them.
Right. And if I can ask, based on your expertise, why do you think that even though we are getting more aware, we have more terminology, we have more language around supporting children who are in the LGBTQ community, why do you think there still aren't systems in place? Why do you think that maybe people are still overlooking this population in the school systems or just in the world in general?
Well, one of the ways that I like to address that question is that these like modern systems, these looking at things, trying to make change happen, are starting to occur in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, Miami, New York. And so these are hubs where people are looking at this and trying to change the conversation. Mm-hmm. But we have an entire world that may not be up to having that conversation and being ready to really understand and recognize that these kids are not only there, but they're a viable and vital part of our population.
Mm-hmm. I love that last part, that not only are they are there, but these children are viable and they are such a vital part of our community and our conversations. So can you elaborate more on that? How can we help people shift that idea that their voices are just as important as the heteronormative voices that we sometimes support more?
Well, I think it's been really exciting with the development of online communities that there has been a lot of more expression and the ability for these kids to get their voices heard. Mm-hmm. There are lots of amazing blogs and vlogs out there that are being written by LGBTQ adolescents that are really saying, here we are, meet us. And the thing that's beautiful about this happening is that kids who don't have access to something that I may have access to in Los Angeles can go online and maybe find a supportive community. One of the best ones that I like to recommend, you may have heard of the Trevor Project. Mm-hmm. They're a national, LGBT suicide organization. They've put out some great programs, but they have a thing called the Trevor Forum. And this is a vetted forum for LGBTQ identified kids to come on and create community with people all over the world. And what's really powerful about this is because it's vetted, it's a safe space for these kids to have these conversations.
That's really helpful that you shared that resource, because I think a lot of teens and even parents who are trying to be supportive, the online world can feel very scary and very unvetted. And so you want your children and your teens to be able to go to these places that are healthy, that aren't just like Instagram or Facebook where anyone can post anything, but where they're safe there.
And one of the things that I always encourage parents to do is go to pflag.org. Mm-hmm. And PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. It's an international organization. And they have local chapters, but what's beautiful about the main website is they have all kinds of really beautifully written free resources for parents who just found out that their kid is questioning their gender, or how to create like school systems, or how to create a great gay-straight alliance at your school. Right. And these brochures are easy to read, they're very well written, they're constantly updated, and they're a great and simple resource for families and educators to access.
Yeah. And so now that we've kind of gotten a really good framework for kind of how you do this work and what it looks like, can we get into maybe explaining what the letters and the acronym mean? Because we've said the acronym a few times, but I would love to kind of have you explain a little bit about what these letters mean and how they might show up as a child is coming out or as they're talking about their identity.
So I tend to go with LGBTQ, and there are acronyms that go on for another 20 letters or so. And that can get really overwhelming and intense.
Yes.
So I use this shorter version, and here's where it goes. So L would be for?
Lesbian.
Yes.
Yes.
So a lesbian is a female who's attracted to another female. And the thing that's important to me in these definitions is that it's not just a sexual component. We're talking emotional, spiritual, intellectual needs. Needs are also met in these connections. And a lot of times when we look at the gay community, it's seen and defined by who you're having sex with. Correct. So in the definition I work with, it's more to look at the whole human being and what they bring to that conversation. So that's the L. So G would be for gay.
Mm-hmm.
That usually identifies a male who is sexually, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually attracted to another male-identified person.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing we found in the community, gay used to be a bigger umbrella term.
Yes.
But what's happened is the lesbian community realized that their needs were not being met under that umbrella. So most women nowadays do prefer to be identified as lesbian, where most men identify as gay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the L and the G.
Yes.
The bisexual community. And this is such a ripe and beautiful community to chat about, because a lot of times people joke that, there's no such thing as bisexuality. Someone's not saying who they are. And the thing that's so amazing is to understand there's a really vital and exciting community of people who are sexually, emotionally, physically, spiritually, intellectually attracted to people of both gender orientations and presentations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that we recognize that this community is real and that we don't just joke about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we hit the T.
Yes.
So the T is where people start getting a little confused. This is the transgender community. Now, within the transgender community, there are lots of different variables and letters that we can use in there. But for the ease of communication, we're going to just use the transgender umbrella for our conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
So a transgender person who someone's assigned sex at birth does not integrate with their identity, their internal sense of self. And so what it usually will involve is some type of expression of that or a transition moving out of that. Mm-hmm. Now, when we're talking about the transgender community, a lot of times what you hear is the words transgender and cisgender. Mm-hmm. And people get really confused because I'm cisgender. Yay, yes. Good for me. So what it simply means is, let's go back to the Latin. Transgender, the word trans, actually just means on the other side of. Mm. Okay? So that means that my sexual identity that I was assigned at birth does not agree with my gender identity, my feeling of who I am. And cisgender is simply on the same side of. So that the assigned birth sex I have and my sense of my gender identity are in alignment and agreement. And that's all it means. So nobody's saying anything offensive when they say we're cisgender.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And the things to understand about working, especially with transgender adolescents, is to know that there are many layers of a coming out process that happen here. Often we start on a social level. We're looking at name changes, interacting with pronouns differently, pieces like that. Medical usually start a little bit later. And in this case, we're looking at actually using hormone therapy and maybe top or bottom surgery at a later date. Okay, so we got LGBTQ. So Q is actually how I identify, which is this queer. And queer is a really fascinating word in our community because initially it was a word that was used to be derogatory. Mm-hmm. It was used to put down the gay community. Mm-hmm. And what's happened, those of us who are activists and advocates in the field have taken this word back and say, yes, we are queer, and this queer has this beautiful power to it. And it's also stepping back, what we talked about earlier, moving away from this idea that it's just about who you sleep with, but it's more about who you are as a whole person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to just say, just listening to you talk about this is such a breath of fresh air, because I love how you talked about how your gender and your sexual identity has nothing to do with who you're sleeping with, who you are sexually engaged with. It has such a huger implication for your whole self and your whole existence. So I really love that you shared that perspective, because as I think about the next question, which is, how can a parent be more supportive of their child if the child is already identified this way, or if the child is kind of going through this transition where they are trying to figure out how they want to show up in the world? I feel like most parents, they go right to the sex. Right? They go right to, oh my God, my kid is thinking about sex, right? And so can you talk us through a little bit about how to help parents? And again, I know this is a bigger 2-hour whole day training.
Oh yeah, I'm here to speak at a conference. I'll help you through this.
Right.
Actually, the place that I would like to start answering that question from is a very simple place. And it's helping parents understand that they're probably going through a grief process when their kid comes out to them. Excuse me. So what we're talking about here is they're going to go through some denial, some anger, some bargaining, some depression and acceptance. Those kind of classic Kubler-Ross pieces. And what this it really addresses this idea that when a kid is born, and I can like kind of go back into the old West. You know, kids born, they come out, the doctor picks them up, slaps them on the behind and says, it's a boy, it's a girl. And then parents project forward this entire lifetime for their child. You know, where they're going to go to school, then they're going to college, and then they're going to get married and have a picket fence and, you know, a golden retriever and 2.5 kids and live right next door.
Yes.
You know, parents have projected this whole story. So when a kid comes out to them, what happens is that dream shatters. And for me as a clinician, it's important to create some space around that grief process so that the kids know that their parents are grieving and the parents understand the feelings they're having are actually a process itself. So that's one of the first places I like to start with parents. I think it's really important to help them understand their own feelings in this moment.
Yeah. Your explanation is totally after my own heart, because I think a lot of times clinicians, especially when you're working with children who are kind of atypically developing or who have other identities that are not as traditional as we understand them, they don't give that space to parents to grieve. So I love hearing you say it's totally in alignment with in-parent shaming. It's totally in alignment with shameful parenting. So whether you knew that or not, I'm just sitting here like, oh, holding my heart. So kind of go into that next piece then, where after you've allowed the parent to have that space in that grief process, where do you take them next?
Well, there are a couple of different directions. One of them is gathering information. Some of the sites I mentioned earlier are places I send parents to gather information and support. The other piece of the puzzle is to really help the parents understand the layers and levels of a coming out process. Because we don't just say a coming out moment.
Yes.
We say a coming out process.
Yes.
The coming out process is actually a lifelong experience. Maybe a kid comes out and then parents have tons of questions. What does that mean? Who are you going to be? And the kid doesn't know yet. And then they go away to college and they start learning more. Identity formation starts. And then they come home and they can talk more about that. And then they start in their first relationship, and that's a coming out process of its own.
Mm-hmm.
So really helping parents understand, and the kids as well, that coming out is a lifelong process. I also encourage parents to understand that they are going to need their own spaces of safety to have conversation, either with me or creating other systems for them to talk. And that it's also really important that parents understand that they're going to have a ton of questions and their kid may not have the answer at this moment. Mm-hmm. And that has got to be okay. Yes. And the best thing we can do as supporting these kids coming out is to go back to Carl Rogers and simply provide unconditional positive care. To be there with these kids, to love them, to care for them, to help them walk through what can be a really rough story for a lot of them.
Right. And as I'm listening to this whole kind of person approach that you have, where it's not just the kid, but like you said earlier, it's the whole family. You're really helping everyone come into this healthy, nurturing space. Mm-hmm. What I think now is, and it kind of goes in line with what I do, is this idea of now I have to step out to the world. Now we've got to present our family and the structure that we've created and we've held for each other to others. And how do you deal with those questions of, well, it was a parent's fault, or you should have raised them a certain way, or if you had just kept them in church, it would have gone better, and all these different things that people kind of throw at the parent and at the child as well about that coming out process.
Well, I think it's important to really look at the family system as a whole. Mm-hmm. We have to understand how families connect into their communities, how they connect into communities of color, how they connect into communities of religion and spirituality, and see how the messages of those communities are affecting the coming out process for the kids and their families. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I'm really, really adamant about with my parents is that their kids should have control of how the story is released. It's really important because we are looking at issues of safety in this moment.
Yes.
And anytime I have a kid in my office says, okay, I want to come out to someone, we actually walk through a conversation. It's like, will that be safe? When you offer to that person, will they be able to handle the anxiety of stress of having this big piece of information without needing to share it? Because the minute we share that story with someone, we lose complete control over it. Yeah. And, you know, it's really funny because I sometimes have very well-meaning parents who come in and they're like, okay, I got it. I'm supporting my kid. This is amazing. They're transgender. I'm so excited. And then they go home and they announce it to the entire rest of the biological family.
Right.
And they tell aunts and uncles and grandma and grandpa, and the kid is like freaking out because they haven't had an agency in coming out as they're wanting to come out.
Right. Right. And so how do you help manage that? Because I think, again, as someone who works with parents, parents feel like, well, I'm over you. I'm your caregiver. I'm the person who takes care of you. So why don't I have the agency to do this? You're still my child. You're still in my house.
Well, taking it out of just the LGBTQ piece,
Yeah.
I work with adolescents all the time.
Right.
And the biggest thing I hear from parents is, my kids don't listen to me or they don't communicate with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the philosophies I have about that is, are you creating the space to listen to them?
Mm.
Are you telling them how they should be? Or are you bringing curiosity into the conversation and learning about who they are? And it's really fascinating because, parents come in, they say, my kid won't talk to anybody. And the kid sits down and talks to me, and 50 minutes are up and they can't stop talking.
Right.
And
Right.
it's like, no, what they need is a space where they can be listened to without someone telling them who they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I encourage parents to be curious, to ask questions, to be present with this story, and also understand that they're in an education mode themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They need to learn as well, because this is not the same as saying, oh my God, they got in the orchestra, yay,
Right.
my kid's playing first violin. It's not the same thing.
Right.
And so I'm very proactive with parents when they come in to work with me to try and set this model up ahead of time.
Right. Right. And I love that piece of it that you share where the parents are in education mode too. And I think sometimes that kind of comes up against their parenting identity where they're supposed to be the know-all understanding person who has the whole family figured out. But when a child is coming out, and I feel like you said, even outside of that process, when your child is starting to learn things that you don't know about, or they're starting to have an identity that's not as, second nature to you, you are in education mode with your child. You are in the space of, I have to be curious in order to help them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too, because the other thing I look at with parents is creating equity in the household. I had an example of a family where I was working with the younger brother, and he came out. He had come to me because he had attempted suicide. A lot of kids, unfortunately, come to me that way because they come out in the hospital, and then the hospitals or parents find me.
Yes.
So he had come out, we did a lot of work. He was doing amazing, fantastic work. Family embraced the story. Everybody was doing well. Mom even took this kid to Gay Pride. Yay, Mom.
Oh, yay.
Okay. And then we hit a really interesting moment where this kid's older brother, when he was actually 17 years old, had a steady girlfriend. And that steady girlfriend was allowed to stay overnight at the house. So what that's doing is giving tacit agreement that there's probably some kind of sexual contact happening. Interestingly enough, when my client had a boyfriend, they'd been dating a while, wanted to spend a night, parents were freaking out and didn't want to let it happen. And so this is where it's working with parents to look at, are you treating your kids equitably? Are you looking at where your biases and agendas may be showing up as these things are progressing?
Yeah. And I love that example, because I think that happens sometimes, that even in gender identities, right, that sometimes we will let our male identified children do things that we might be too scared to let our female identified children do. And so it shows up in sexual identity too, it seems like, where, okay, well, this is heteronormative for him to have a girlfriend at 17 and her come over, but is this the same thing for my child who maybe is in the LGBTQ community? How does that look? And maybe the fears. I think one thing I would think about, the fears of what sexuality looks like, or what that whole process looks like for a child who is in the LGBTQ community.
And that's where, if we go back to where we started today, we hit a little bit of that heteronormative story. And that's a prime example of it.
Yes.
And I think it's really important for parents to understand when those moments of, let's call them privilege, show up, and how we need to address them.
Yes.
And the other thing that I think is so important in this conversation, we just kind of glance at it for a moment, is to understand how these experiences happen in communities of color and strongly spiritual communities.
Yes.
Because these two factors greatly affect the coming out process for a lot of kids. And another thing that affects the coming out process for them is education levels and socioeconomic status of the family.
Agreed.
And all of these pieces of intersectionality are really important for us when we're looking at trying to create systems of support.
Agreed.
In Pasadena, I may have kids who are going to very, high-level private schools, identify as white. They've got the resources to come out. They've also got family support in a different way. But a lot of times we find the communities of color, is there's a coming out process where a kid may come out and they're saying, oh, we love you, we love you, we love you, but don't tell anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So what it gives is this message of a damaged identity. And although there's love being expressed, there's this secondary message that's going with it as well.
Yeah.
And these are really important things to understand. And I also talk to parents about understanding how their religious belief systems, whether they have any, bias in them or not, as saying, this particular church says, being gay is an abomination. If the parent is part of that church, the kids join it together and they start creating this idea that their parents will never understand me. They'll kick me out of the house. Mm-hmm. And this is a really important thing to understand, that this is a reality for a lot of kids who come out, is a lot of families, because of their belief systems, cannot support an LGBTQ adolescent, and they kick them out. Yeah. And then we're looking at kids on the streets. We're looking at, sex trade. We're looking at, substance issues. We're looking at greater risk for HIV and STIs. And these are realities of what a lot of kids are facing coming out.
Yeah. And, you mentioned too, the idea of socioeconomic status. And I know that has a huge play on whether or not kids can get the support, if they have the transportation to get the support. And then and you can let me know if I'm correct in this, even for the transgender community, where if that child does want to do the physical transition, whether or not they'll be able to, whether or not they'll have the means to finish that whole transition for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's an interesting study that really looks at the idea of transgender healthcare. Mm-hmm. And it is a really sticky wicket right now, mm-hmm. because most physicians are not trained to work with this population. Mm-hmm. The ones that are in major metropolitan areas. I have clients who are in, let's call them secondary cities, who can't mm-hmm. even find anyone to administer hormone therapy, which is a very base level for a transgender kid in medical transition.
Yeah.
And so it is about trying to educate providers as well to create those spaces. And when we look at the economic thing, this is what's fascinating about the study, is they talked about that although transgender healthcare can be really hard to access, that for a lot of transgender people, the journey of accessing it is so vital to the being of who they are that they find these inner strengths to manage it and make it happen. Mm. And I think that's really, really powerful.
I agree with that. I think it is too. And I think, I feel like it's both. I feel like it's powerful, but also it's like, I wish we had better systems so that way they didn't have to pull all of that out of themselves just mm-hmm. to get up to find somebody. Can you imagine the transition? And I feel like the whole community as well, where it's like, I'm going through this internal process already to tell someone about what I'm experiencing and how I'm identifying. And now I've got to pull all this other strength up just to find someone who understands what I'm going through and can help me with that transition. Right.
And so a lot of times, especially with transgender kids, they will wait till they're away from the family home to start exploring gender identity, maybe at college with medical support systems in place, so they can really look at that on a deeper level.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have 101 more questions to ask you, but I feel like you've given us such a great foundation that if the audience is willing and ready to talk to you more, I would love for you to give us more information about how to contact you and how to connect with you.
Absolutely. So, like I said, I'm located in Pasadena, California. You can find me online at johnsovec.com. You can also find me online at Gay Teen Therapy. Both of those are my sites, and you can access me. You can email me through those sites. You can also get access to my phone number, which is 626-374-7046. And I'm happy to consult and answer questions for people who are walking through this journey.
Yeah. And for people who are not kind of local to you, are you open to them emailing you just to see if you have any resources or ideas to point them in the right direction?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I do these types of conversations, I do get questions from all over the country, and I'm more than happy to do what I call light consultation to try and help resources in an area. Yeah. The one thing that for me is kind of the final thought I'd like to leave people with is that there's this idea of accepting your LGBTQ kid. A lot of parents will use the word, I accept him or her or them exactly as they are. And I push against that word accept, because when I hear it, what it means is there's something damaged and I'm going to look beyond it. Mm. What I prefer is words like embrace, love, care for, support. And that those are the words that can help these kids go through this really amazing and beautiful process, and for families to work together in it.
I love that. Think that was a beautiful kind of wrap up to everything that you were sharing with us. So thank you for sharing that. And for those of you who have been watching and listening, do not fret if you were not able to jot down the resources that John mentioned. They will all be in the show notes that accompany this video. So please feel free to reach out to him and learn more about what he does and the way that he supports the LGBTQ community. Thank you so much, John, for being on with us today. And I look forward to sharing this with our audience.
Thank you. It's been great chatting with you.